All right, welcome everyone. I hope everyone's having a great Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. My name is Eva Lee. If you're here for the first time, I am the owner here of Awesome Careers, a podcast show dedicated to featuring folks from the community about different careers. What is it that they do? What do they love? What do they find challenging? And I'm so glad that you're here with me today. Today marks our last episode for the season. And I'm here with a wonderful person who's going to share their experience. I'm here specifically with Lori Lee, who's an author, specifically children and a middle school age group author. She's going to share about her experience about becoming a writer and author. And just to give you some context here, let me read a little bit more about to give you some context of what she is that she does. So Lori is the author of the MG/YA sci-fi and fantasy fiction. Her books include PAHUA and The Soul Sister, which is the Disney publishing, Force of the Souls, which is a Page Street, and of course the sequel of Broken Webs and others. She's also a contributor to the anthologies of A Thousand Beginnings and Endings and The Color Outside the Lines. She considers herself a unicorn fan, enjoys marathoning TV shows, and loves to write about magic, manipulation, and family. And one of the things that that she wants to leave with readers and audience as you think about becoming a writer is that while there are numerous paths to publication opens to aspiring writers, everything begins with you, a blank page and a determination to tell a story. Writing is as much as a 9-to-5 job, but it requires discipline and self-motivation because the only person setting your hours is you. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. There's a lot of good questions that we're trying to get through. If you have questions or you're tuning in for the first time, or maybe you've been here with us all season long, let me know in chat. Where are you tuning in from? What city and state? And if you have any questions for Lori as you're thinking and hearing more about her experience in becoming an author and writer, feel free to put them in chat. Hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those questions and comments soon. But without further ado, let's bring in Lori. All right. Okay. All right, Lori, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate that. It's been a happy spring. Hopefully it's nice and blooming in your your part of the world.
It's getting warmer every day. Enjoying
It's
it.
getting warmer. Yeah, it's wonderful. And I know that, what is it? You have two very exciting things happening this year. We'll get to them in a bit. But before we do, tell us a little bit more, about your experience and how did you get started into becoming an author and writer?
So I've been writing for as long as I can remember, from short stories about vengeful ghosts to like a 300-page handwritten fantasy that I wrote in like middle school. Handwritten because I'm aging myself now, but that was before the internet. So handwritten. Um, but I knew very early on that I wanted to be a published author, but I didn't seriously begin pursuing publication until maybe like 2009, 2010, which was when I wrote my first novel with the intent to get it published. I knew absolutely nothing about the publication process, but luckily the internet did exist by then, and there were a lot of resources to help me figure it out. I had just discovered NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. For those who don't know, it's in November, where people attempt, like thousands and thousands of people attempt to write 50,000 words in 1 month, which sounds bananas, but and lots of people do it. So so I figured this was the push I needed to get this book written, and I did write it, and I learned a ton about what does and does not work for me. And then fast forward a year later, I had revised the book a half dozen times. I had gotten a critique partner, revised it some more, and then I began researching how to write a query, which is a query is basically like, like when you look at the back of a book, or you open the flap jacket and you see like a little summary, a little blurb to tell you that tells you what the book is about. Mm-hmm. That's basically what a query is. So what you're trying to do is you're writing the query and you're sending them out to literary agents, and you want to entice them to want to read your book. Because if they request the book, then if the query entices them and then they request your book, you send your book off to them, they read the book, ideally they love the book and they offer you representation. I
Ah,
should clarify that this is specifically for traditional publishing. There's so many paths to publication now. There's self-publishing, there's indie publishing, and then there's traditional publishing, which is being published through a publisher for distribution into bookstores and libraries,
okay, we'll
which
get
is
to
what
that
I
in a
want.
bit. Yeah, I want to say, okay, that's great, but I want to learn a little bit more, and I want to our audience here to learn a little bit more about you. Like, how did you know you wanted to be a writer and author? You mentioned you started writing, and then eventually eventually sounded to me like you eventually had the vision of I'm going to get published. But before that, so tell us a little bit more. Like, how did you transition to becoming an author or writer? You mentioned you wrote early on, but what would you write about? What you mentioned ghosts, which is probably something very different than what probably most people grow up writing about. How did you know you wanted to write this?
I've always been uh, a big reader. I've loved to read for as long as I can remember as well. And I'm pretty sure my first exposure to like ghost stories and the idea of like that otherworldly magic stuff was through a dunning, right? Like most of us would say that, right? But after that, I fell in love with fairy tales and Greek mythology, and then R.L. Stein's Fear Street, which is why I was writing horror and ghost stories. I loved Fear Street so much. Um, and this was in like elementary school, so I was quite young reading teen horror, but and then I also fell in love with Tolkien's The Hobbit, with the Chronicles of Narnia, and with those last ones, that's sort of when it clicked with me that I was absolutely convinced this is what I need to write. Like these sorts of sweeping fantasies that pull you into like completely different worlds with like magic and adventure and the hero's journey. Those were the kinds of books that I absolutely wanted to write.
Oh, that's so exciting. And it's funny because I remember watching the shows and reading the books too as a kid, like the R.L. Stein horror. If folks remember, okay, this is like the 90s, all right. It was big back then. But I remember that and it's so captivating because it was so scary, but at the same time, it was so different than what you were probably used to. I remember reading books as early as like um what is it? And there are coming more movies that are coming out of them. So, for example, yes, the Chronicles of Narnia. I literally remember reading that book as a kid. Um, Peter Rabbit. Oh my goodness, like one of the
Oh
earliest
yeah.
onset. All of those, like Peter Rabbit is very different from R.L. Stein's books.
Yeah.
Completely opposite,
Quite different.
right? But I imagine like so to me it sounds like just having that motivation and like really enjoying the mystery, the fantasy of it. So that's really good. And yes, you're saying like ghost stories is very scary and exciting all at the same time. It's hilarious. I think yesterday I was just watching the whole Annabelle series, the Conjuring series,
Oh
and
gosh.
sometimes I'm like, "Ooh, this is too close, man. This is way too
I'm
close."
actually a huge chicken. I can't actually watch horror movies, which sounds really funny. I can read horror books. I can't watch horror movies.
Really? Do you think when you compare, for example, the details in the book versus the details in the movie?
I just try to avoid the movie altogether. So if you're talking about horror, I mean, if you're talking about horror.
I think it's because the movies, like the sound, makes it like like the sounds and noises amplify the moods and scenes more.
It doesn't leave much to your imagination when you're seeing it there in front of you versus the book. But I don't know what it is. If I love reading like one of my favorite books is actually called Anna Dressed in Blood, and it's a horror novel, and it's so good. And but like I could never watch the movie. I think I was actually less of a chicken when I was a kid because I read the Fear Street novels and I read like the ghost stories to tell in the dark, whatever that is, and I loved them. I devoured them, and I wrote these short stories about teens falling in love, and then one of them getting gruesomely murdered by a ghost. So like I feel like I was more of a badass as a kid than I am now.
Good to know. Good to know. All right. And so we learned about how you become interest essentially to this career path, and you started writing more. How did you know if there was going to be a hobby versus a career?
I think it comes down to like how much you want it, how much passion you have for it. I mean, which is not to say that people are not passionate about their hobbies. It's just that, you know, so many people say they want to write a book. You know what I mean? I've heard that so many times. Like when people find out that I'm an author, they're just like, oh, I've always wanted to write a book if I had time, you know? You know what I mean? It's like one of those things where if you write for a hobby, that is totally okay. That's valid. Like a lot of people write just for themselves and they never have any intention to share it. And that is totally okay. I wanted to write and I wanted to share my stories because I feel like as a kid, books just played a huge part in like the escapism of like bringing me joy as a child. Like I'm gonna be real with you here. Like we grew up in a small town that was overwhelmingly white, and there was a lot of racism and a lot of like you know, that kind of stuff going on in our town. And I was, you know, we hadn't been in America for super long, and so I was trying to fit in and I was trying to figure out where I fit in. And so books just helped me get through that by providing this escape from all this uncertainty and like from all the real world issues that I had to deal with. So in me writing, in me creating these stories, I want to be able to provide that for other readers as well.
Yeah, it's like, and thank you for sharing that. I think that's wonderful. And I think a lot of authors, even the ones like Tolkien, for example, right, living in a time of World War One, experiencing that and writing a whole entire different world. And that's what I kind of love also with for example, with the Chronicles of Narnia, those were also the time of era of, if you look at, you know, the time frame, they were in times where it wasn't a perfect world. And a lot of folks, young authors, were fantasizing about this perfect world you can live and have the superpowers, right? If you can do something
Right,
different and
and it's
unique.
not even so much that these worlds are perfect, it's
Yeah.
that they provide a safe space
Yeah.
in which to tackle these real life issues because they feel more distant, they feel more magical. They are more they are sometimes literally magical.
Uh-huh.
You know, and so it's a safe place to deal with all the issues aren't that aren't where it's not quite so raw.
Yes, yes, and absolutely. We got here a question from Bao too as well. I want to quickly put, Bao says, I love the horror, but I've not actually read a horror novel before seeing the movie. Next time I will read the story first to let my imagination loose rather than seeing what they portray on the big screen media. Thank you, Bao. And Bao did have a question for you. How do you go about getting editors? Because you mentioned early on you would write, have them edit, review it, go back and revise it and rewrite it again. How did you go about that?
So for me, I think this has more to do with the different publication paths. For me, I did not hire any editors. My editor is an editor at the publishing house that acquired my book, books plural. So when the first step I did was I got a literary agent because with traditional publishing, like if you want to be published by a publisher that can get your book into a bookstore or into libraries or into schools, etc., then typically you'd have to go through a traditional publisher like Simon and Schuster or HarperCollins or Disney Publishing. So in order to do that, you have to have a literary agent because the literary agent is the one who will submit your book for you to those editors. And then once she does that, he or she, sorry, once they do that, and once you're on submission, if you're very fortunate, if all the stars align, you know, then an editor will fall in love with your book. They'll take it to an acquisitions meeting at that publisher. They'll talk about, you know, profit and loss and all these numbers, whatever, and then they'll decide whether they want to offer on your book. And ideally, if they offer on your book, that's great. And then, you know, you get the contract, you do all the less fun stuff about publishing.
Logistical, yeah.
Yes, right. Um, and then your editor, and then you get to work. Your editor reads your book half a dozen times. You know, they give you what's called the editorial letter. It's my editorial letter was like, I don't know, 19 pages long or something like that. um, yeah. And then you get to work and you revise your butt off. But that's traditional publishing. If you want to do self-publishing, in which case you would actually have to hire an editor yourself, you actually don't have to. I should not have said that. You don't have to hire an editor. That is entirely voluntary, whether you want to hire an editor or not. Like a lot of writers are really great writers. They usually just hire a copy editor to look over like their grammar and like if like consistency and stuff, because like you can be a great storyteller, you can absolutely suck about knowing where commas go. You know what I mean?
Right. So yeah, so let's take a pause on that. I don't think people understand that, and I'm still learning more about that too. So you're the author, the writer, and there are different roles that you work with to get your book published, such as the editor, which you mentioned, right, who will give you feedback. So they read through your whole entire script and give you feedback. And like when I'm hearing feedback, I'm thinking the red markers are out, circle lines everywhere, right?
It is, yes, exactly like that, except virtually with like typically through Word.
Mm-hmm. And then you have the copy editor. How is the editor and copy editor different? What are the, like you mentioned, like the copy editor can go through your whole entire grammar, but not look for the details of like the character buildup or things like that, right?
Right. So your editor is looking at like the big picture stuff. Well, it depends on the editor. They start big and then they, narrow it down as the book gets into the right shape it should be in. So like for example, with Forest of Souls, which came out last year, my editor wanted me to add a character like who had left early on into like the entire rest of the book, and to restructure a whole bunch of things. I had to move scenes around, had to rewrite a decent portion of the book, but it got to a place where we were all very happy with it. And then and I should also add that an editor at a publishing see, this is what I'm doing, I'm like, well, at a publishing house,
Good.
they are not just they're not just editing your book for you. They're also sort of like the person who you're always in contact with at the publisher. Like, I don't want to say your rep, because your agent is your rep, but they are the person, like your person at that house. Like if
So it sounds like you're related to the publishing company.
Right. Like if you want to ask for anything, like promo wise, book wise, cover wise, or whatever, you would have to go through your editor. Right. So you would not typically speak directly to like, all the other people behind the scenes at a publisher. You would speak to your editor first, and your editor would convey it to whichever team it's relevant to. And then the copy editor doesn't do all that stuff. The copy editor is just there for one job. Like, copy editor does an amazing job. I'm not like diminishing the work that they do, but they focus primarily on consistency throughout the novel, grammar and syntax, and like with if the publishing has a house style, that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you. That's so helpful. So, when you're working on this book, right, you're working with different folks who are going to essentially read and review your work. And I'm curious, do you ever feel like I feel so like conscious, or I get so like not super anxious, but I feel so vulnerable, like having people read my work. And it's funny too, because I don't write, you're obviously fantasy stuff. I wrote grants before, right? Which is a different style of writing. It's no fantasy. It's very plain and boring. But like, do you ever get like scared, or like, how do you take feedback from other people?
That is a skill that is absolutely necessary in this industry. You have to be able to take critique and not take it personally.
Right.
You have to also be able to identify, I think, when critique is right for you, because most authors have what's called a critique partner. I have a critique partner. Her name is Mindy Arnett. She's amazing. Sorry, I'm going to plug her real quick. But she reads my work. She's another author, and she reads my work, and she offers critique before it ever goes to my agent. And I read her work, and we critique each other's work for each other. So being able to critique someone's work, being able to identify when someone's critique is something that will work for you versus I don't agree with that, is also a skill that you should have. And and also being able to separate it emotionally. Like if someone says this character is kind of flat, and that's one of your favorite characters, you know, you have to be able to separate yourself between, am I reacting emotionally? Am I thinking you're wrong because I love that character? Or, you know, are you thinking, okay, maybe like I love this character, but is this person wrong or are they actually right? So, you know, it's something that you have to sort of develop. It's definitely not a skill that you just like have. It takes time and experience. And I've been in the publishing industry for about a decade now. So so like I feel like I have a pretty tough skin at this point. but I will say that every time I get an editorial letter from my editor, I I like I can't even look at it for the first day. I just leave it in my inbox because I'm just like all anxious and fluttery. I'm just like, how much work am I going to have to do on this novel? Yet, you know, so like I just leave it there and I can't like I'll open it and I'll skim it very little bit and I'll send, you know, a confirmation email and I got it, and then like I'll wait a few days when I'm like I feel like more prepared and then I'll read through it.
Right.
Yeah, so
That's your process in reviewing your critique work, right? And it sounds like it's been working for you, and it's a way to separate, you know, your personal, you know, support and need for certain characters or your work, and really being open to the critique and the feedback, and being able to kind of push back and assess and see like this works or this doesn't, or I don't agree. Which is something I guess, like I guess maybe as a kid, when I read a lot of books too, and even with movies, right? We watch them and I'm always like, why do they always kill off the best friend character? You know, they're always injured. Like, I'm like, why? They were my favorite character versus the main character. So now I could see where, you know, character development, you're trying to develop something, and that's those decisions that as a writer and author, you're making the decision about, like, do we kill off this character? Do we injure this character? Is this the last scene for the character? Right. So
you sort of have to make those decisions if it makes sense to the plot. Like I will say, anyone who like kills off a character just for the emotional impact is not a good writer. It has to make sense.
Right. Okay, we got some thing here too. Belle says, I think we hear about struggling artists and authors. What are some advice you have to actually make money about being an author if this is someone's dream?
This is a tough one, I have to say, because you, as an author, you absolutely deserve to write as a living. You deserve to make a living off of what you do, because it is work. No matter how much you love it, no matter how passionate you are about it, it's still work, and you deserve to be paid for it. Having said that, publishing is not a reliable source of income. I will say that. Again, it depends on the path of publication that you want to take. Traditional publishing, for me, like you can work on a book for years, literal years, and you can get an agent, you can go out on submission, and it could still never sell to a publisher. There's just no guarantee. But with like if you self-publish, that's a different story. You know, you can like work on your book, you get to set when it releases, you can guarantee that it's going to go out, go on sale. Like you can just throw it up on Amazon, CreateSpace, or I don't know if CreateSpace is still a thing, sorry. But yeah, and then you can, and if you're a prolific writer, if you write a lot, if you write fast, that's sort of ideal for self-publishing, because readers respond better to, in self-publishing, to books that they can get, to book series specifically that they can get like from an author more quickly, which I'm not a prolific writer. I can maybe crank out one book a year. And traditional publishing is much more slow. Like I sold Forest of Souls, which came out last year. I wrote it in 2014, I think is when I first wrote it.
Yeah.
It sold in 2017, 2018. No, 2018. It sold in 2018. It came out in 2020. So traditional publishing is slow. So if you want, to be faster, if you're a fast writer, if you're a prolific writer, I think self-publishing is a really good route for that.
Yeah, it sounds like the fastest route to get essentially your content to the audience, right? If you self-publish
Right.
versus going
There's pros
traditional
and
way.
cons to each one. Like with self-publishing, it's very fast. You control everything from literally the words on the page to like the product you put out to like the cover, how it looks, like your marketing, all that stuff. You control everything, which is great. And you can guarantee that it will get in front of readers, online at least, with traditional publishing, I don't have to worry about the book covers. I don't have to worry too much about the marketing. As over the years, an author has actually, in traditional publishing, authors are actually becoming more and more expected to do promotion for their works, which I'm not sure if I agree with, but I mean, it is what it is. But an author only has so much reach. Like I can't reach not worldwide, nationwide librarians the way my publisher can. I can't reach like bookstores all across the country the way my publishers can. So that is like absolutely a pro of being traditionally published. But again, the con is that it is very slow, and I don't know, some people like having full control over like the product that they put out. For me, I just want to worry about the words on the page. I don't want to have to worry about formatting and the cover and all that stuff that I'm not an expert in.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's just understanding like what are your needs, right?
Right. What do
which
you want
path
to
is
do?
going to be more ideal for you. Great. And I know we have a question from Jennifer. How do you go about world building in your world building in your stories? Do you ever get hung up on the details or facts?
Yes, absolutely. So, I made the mistake once of like writing out an entire world building like fact sheet. Basically, it's like 20 pages like world building for my book before I had actually even started writing it. And then I scrapped the whole thing, because once I started writing, just so much changed in the actual process of the writing that this entire guide that I had just like spent so much time on, and with like details and like economy and trade and like whatever, it was just like completely like tossed it out, because none of it like even mattered anymore, because things had changed in the actual process of the writing. So like the lesson here is, to not actually let yourself be so preoccupied by these little details when you're writing it, unless of course they're relevant to the plot. But I feel like layering in those details, layering in the world building, is something that you can do in the revision process. Like my first drafts are just a mess. They're chaotic. They're chaos. Pure chaos. And nobody reads the first draft except for me, my agent, my critique partners. They're not allowed to see my first drafts. But they are bare bones. They're just like the plot. They're just only what is absolutely necessary to the plot to keep moving forward. And then after that, I fix the writing and I fix the pacing and the plot, and then I begin to layer in the details. I layer in the setting. I layer in, descriptions of like the food and the location and how this is relevant to like these little. I'll leave myself notes like to say notes that are just like, describe this in better detail or something, and like all that stuff, all the polishing and the world building and the details, that's the kind of stuff that you can layer in later on in the story.
Good. Thanks for letting us know about that. Yes, so it's funny because I help people write, but my way of helping people is very different from obviously yours. I help people write their resumes. And I think what I've learned over the years was, as I help people write, right? How do I take something abstract that's up here and put it on paper? And one of my favorite ways to help people think about how to write it, I tell folks, you're in draft mode. There's no perfect version. So
Yeah.
because right now people get fixed, right? When you're writing, people get fixed, and I'm guilty of it too. We get fixed on trying to write it perfect the first time. And I tell folks all the time, no, we're in draft mode. Think of it this way. You're in draft mode. There's no perfect version of it. Just put the bare bones, like you're saying, like the bare essentials, just get it on paper right now. And when you go to editing, that's when you can scrap off and add those details or quantify, right? All the important stuff. But, and I've realized like, and that's like basic, I know it's like, I've heard called this basic high school English, right? Where we learn about, again, draft mode, editing mode. And that helps. I've seen that approach help a lot of my resume writers dramatically about how they, again, get their context onto paper. It's funny because it's like something like you think everybody who has a K through 12 education will probably do. Yes, but to do it yourself, it's probably one of the hardest. So how do you not get hung up on the details is move away and just realizing that you're in draft mode. There's no perfect version. Okay, we have such, and then Jennifer says that such great info. And Val says, wow, that's a long process. Sounds like authors have to be ahead of the trends. And I know that Jennifer had another one. I done Nano Real Mo. I'm guessing that's a tool too. It's super challenging to staying consistent. How do you inspire yourself to write when you're not feeling in the mood?
Oh, that's a tough one, especially with NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month. And you have to, I think if you do 50,000 words a month, I think that's like 1,600 plus words a day, which is a lot. And you have to do it every day consistently. If you fall behind, then it's like, oh no, I have to write over 3,000 words the next day, you know? So the way I do it is that I outline. That is the only way I can be consistent every day when I'm actively drafting, which is I'm actively drafting right now, actually. And I have a 39-page outline prepared because I am an absolute plotter. So there's two terms that we tend to throw around, which is pantser, which is someone who writes by the seat of their pants, or a plotter, someone who has to outline and plot the book before they start. And that's me. I have to outline. If I don't outline and I get stuck, I'm just stuck. And then I have no idea what to do. So the way that I deal with that is that I outline religiously, like super duper detailed outlines, 39-page outline for my book. So even if I don't feel like writing, even if I don't feel inspired by the words that I'm putting down on the page, at least I know what I have to write because I have an outline. So I'm looking at the outline and I know I'm gonna have to write this scene today. So I'm just gonna throw out the words, and I'm not gonna worry about whether they're good or not. I'm just, this is the scene I have to write today. So this is the scene I'm writing. And that's the only way I can push through. I guess it's a form of writer's block. Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. Now, tell us a little bit more. Like, what did your parents think of you? How did, as an author, writer, how did you describe to them saying, Mom, Dad, I'm going to go and become a writer and author?
To be honest,
how do they
I'm
understand
not entirely sure that my mom understood what I wanted to do as a kid. When I was little, she knew I liked writing, and she always supported. I was very lucky that she was actually very supportive. And she never, and my entire family was actually very supportive. They never told me that writing is impractical. You shouldn't write. But I actually don't know how she describes it to other people. I've never seen it. Yeah, I've never heard it, so I don't know how she describes it to other people. But she has. I mean, she understands. She's fluent in English, but I don't know that she actually reads my books because they're very. They're probably too long for her to read. Which I'm not saying my mom is not smart. She's incredibly intelligent. But it's just not her cup of tea. It's not something that she would read. And I'm okay with that. And she's still very proud of me, and she keeps my books on her shelves, and she like to show off and stuff. But I don't actually know how she talks about my books to other people. I should ask her that.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one to see if you guys do like a guessing game and see how she describes it or something like that. So we talked a little bit about the challenges in becoming an author and writer, like from publishing to even writer's block a little bit more. And you actually highlighted one of the essential skills, right, which is like being able to write as well as obtain feedback and provide feedback, right, which is something that's constantly being developed as a writer and author, not something that happens overnight. And I'm wondering really quick, like, what did you do prior to writing, for example? Like, what did you do to prepare you for this? Like, for example, did you go volunteer to write at, for example, newspapers or blogs, or were there any of those things that you experienced it to before you wrote a novel or stories?
I feel like I don't want this to sound sarcastic because I'm not being sarcastic, but literally the best learning tool is reading to write.
Mhm.
Best way to learn to write is to read and to write. Like reading widely, like not just in the genre that you want to write, not just in the category that you want to write, but and understanding that there's always more to learn, like never growing complacent with like your understanding of storytelling. Um, um, the way I try to do this, the way I have done this, is by reading craft books, by reading books in formats that are like unconventional, like books written in verse, books, epistolary books, or reading books in genres I don't typically write, like contemporary and thriller and horror and romance, memoir, nonfiction, like, you know, none of these things I write, but I read them because every book that you read, whether it's good or bad, whether it's in a genre that you write or not, whether it's in a
Mhm.
category that you want to write, is helping you to build your writing toolkit.
Mhm.
You know, your writing arsenal. Like you learn what to do, what not to do. You learn to draw from more than just the stereotypes of the genre, how to twist genre convention. Like it's a common saying, but you have to know the rules before you can effectively break them. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really good. So doing a whole lot more reading and challenge yourself to read the different, genres, different books, different types that you would never write. But I think what essentially is you're self-taught. It's like self-taught. You're teaching yourself how to write, how to read. So that way, when you design your own, when you write your own, you know what style you're going to probably
Like
aim for.
writing like any skill is it takes practice. I mean, it's working those writing muscles like again and again until you become comfortable and confident, and then pushing yourself even further. Um, you don't have to write every day. I feel like it's really important to rest and refill your creative well and do something else. But then you have to be disciplined when it's time to work and get those words down. And it's also really important to find what works for you. What works for one writer might not work for another writer. I mean, um, some writers write to music. Some writers need complete silence. Some writers write in cafes with people moving all around them and voices and loud noises and stuff. Again, like I said, I'm a plotter. I figured out that I'm a plotter. I'm not a pantser, you know, and all these things. Unfortunately, the only way to learn these things about yourself is to write. Like literally, craft and character arcs and building your storytelling toolkit, all that stuff, are all things you can learn through studying and through like reading, consuming a lot of books and stuff. But getting good at it, at using those tools in your toolkit and learning what works for you is something you can only do by actually writing and writing a lot.
Great. That's a great tip there. Um, so I'm wondering here, as a fun tool here, if you were able to solve world problems, right? And you can solve it, how would you go about doing it?
I feel like right now I would probably want to help solve climate change.
Climate change.
Um, I am not smart enough to figure out how I would fix it. I feel like the best thing I could do would be to fund those who are smart enough to fix it.
Wonderful. And if you can turn back time, go to this 18-year-old version of you, what would you tell her?
Oh gosh. Um, I would tell her not to sacrifice her dreams for the sake of others. That things turn out okay, despite that there will be doubt and grief and some mental health breakdowns, but there will also be laughter and joy and happiness and lots of good things ahead.
Wonderful. Um, and I'm curious, if you weren't a writer and author and you had to do something different as in career-wise, what would you be? Like, what would you actually end up pursuing if you weren't a writer and author? Of course, don't think about what mom and dad's going to say or the education required or the money needed.
I think I would be a historian.
Ah,
History and English were actually my favorite subjects in
mhm.
school. And I think I would love to study Asian history specifically, and possibly even teach it at a university because I think that would be super cool. Becoming a professor was actually something I had briefly considered in high school or in college.
That's wonderful. Actually, professors are using those same skills too. Writing, critiquing, providing feedback. So a lot of professors, especially at big universities, a good chunk of their time is actually to do public work too, publication to publish. But of course, genre of writing is very different in academic settings versus fantasy. Yeah.
Yes, and actually academics or the academic world is not super fond of genre fiction. they're very into the literary fiction.
Right. And we have some questions, some thoughts here. Definitely. That's wonderful. I work at the Nature Conservancy.
Aww.
Thank you, Jennifer. And of course, wonderful advice to the 18-year-old self. Totally agree. Thank you, Ash, for joining us. Appreciate that. And of course, what is P. Laura mentioned, I just discovered your writing. I'm looking forward to The Broken Web and The Poet and the Soul Stealer. So absolutely. I know that and as I think about, you were sharing about your experience and like trying to get published, in your writing modes and things like that. I'm wondering, and I ask this for all my guests, as a person of color who is going to becoming a writer, and as you were going through yourself, did you ever experience challenges in the workplace? So in this case, like trying to get published, trying to get seen, visibility, was there any point in time like you, were either like, for example, like you felt some challenges, is it because of your race, because of your gender? I know that, for example, in a few, interviews, for example, like I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter series, right? Like J.K. Rowling, when I remember reading it in middle school, and I thought J.K. was a male. because I didn't know who the author was. And like most people as a kid, I don't read the author's bio. I just go straight to the next chapter. And so I didn't realize until much later, I'm like, oh my goodness, JK's a female writer. And it blew my mind. And it made me love the book even more. But I didn't even think about that. And how when she was talking about how her publishers, encourage her to, change it to abbreviated name because, more people are more likely to pick it up because they think you're a male versus her full name. Do those situations ever come up, or did you ever experience something like that?
In terms of like pen names specifically, I was actually pretty fortunate. No one ever said anything. But also my name is Lori. So I mean it's not like okay, I should specify. In YA fiction specifically, it is a genre, or not a genre, a category that is primarily dominated by women. So there's not much of a
let's clarify. When you mention a YA, I don't think our audience understand that's for young. It stands for young adults.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, young adult fiction, which is like typically the teen years. It is an age category that is dominated by women, and that is one of the few publishing spheres besides romance that is dominated by women. So on the one hand, because it is dominated by women, is typically looked down on because that is the thing that people do when there's too many women. It's like, oh, that must be something fluffy and whatever, and like it's like a systemic issue, right? But on the other hand, also, you would not see someone in YA recommend you to change your name to appear to make your gender more ambiguous. So that's like a plus side, I guess, of being in YA. But on the other hand, YA does have a lot of its issues. And I shouldn't say YA in general and specifically, I mean, because this is a publishing wide issue. But my debut novel came out in 2014 and my agent sold it in 2012. So I've had the privilege of watching in real time the push for more diverse books play out in publishing over this past decade. Back when I first began publishing, there were very, very, very few Asian authors in YA. I could literally count them on one hand. Books about Black and Asian characters were getting whitewashed covers, and the only Asian-inspired books getting the big marketing pushes were ones that were written by white authors. The middle grade book, PAHUA and the Soul Stealer, that is coming out in September by Disney Publishing, I honestly don't think it would have sold had I written it back then. Editors were telling Asian authors that their books were too niche, that writers or that readers wouldn't be able to connect to their stories, that no one wanted to read about Asian characters, which is obviously incredibly racist. But like, even if the story itself had nothing to do with our cultures, like if it was like a space opera, sci-fi, like adventure or whatever, and literally just happened to star Asian characters, bookstores back then, and in some cases still do, would literally just shelve them in obscure niche genre shelves, like making them essentially impossible to discover simply because of
Right.
the race of the characters,
Hmm.
or sometimes just because of the name of the author on the cover. And it was ridiculous. But then the We Need Diverse Books movement happened, and it drastically changed the YA publishing landscape. We began seeing diversity panels and more awareness of systemic racism, and more authors of color getting bigger book deals, getting better marketing push.
Hmm.
But the downside, I wouldn't say it's not necessarily a downside, but it is like a flip side to this is that there also began to form this false impression that white authors now had a disadvantage because publishing only wanted diverse books. It's that saying where you're so used to being the majority, to having everything center you, that equality looks like oppression. Um, so the CCBC, which is the Cooperative Children's Book Center, they released a report of the numbers of children's and YA books by and about Black, Indigenous, and people of color that published in 2019. The numbers were overwhelmingly white. This is 2019, like years after We Need Diverse Books, years after, like, you know, so many more Asian authors and Black authors and like Indigenous authors are getting book deals and like being able to write these stories and having them published. This is in 2019, and the numbers were still overwhelmingly white. Like, in fact, the number of books featuring animals and non-human characters was more than the total combined books of sorry, let me start over. The total combined number of books about Black, Indigenous, people of color characters. Like, it's still wildly disproportionate.
Hmm.
And this is YA, where the space where there is, I would say, some of the most change happening in publishing. YA is one of the few categories of publishing where we're actually talking and tackling and like um, open to discussing these issues, versus other publishing spaces where they're still very like, you know, don't stir up trouble sort of thing. This is happening in YA, which is very progressive. So it's actually even worse in other age categories and other genres. So there's still a lot of work to do in publishing towards
Right.
being more inclusive.
Yes, and I would love to see that. I would love to see more diverse authors. I would love to see more diverse characters. As I mentioned, like, I would read something early on. As a kid, I remember reading Peter Rabbit, which is another animal book, right?
Yes.
To reading fantasies like Narnia, and I'm always wondering, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool? And I didn't, to be honest, as a child, I didn't read anything that was close enough to having a female character that was Asian. And
Yeah.
I so wish, and I can't wait for your books to come out too, because I know I'll be having it on my shelves. I've been making a goal to collect more people of color authors, novels, because I think that's so important. I think that, these stories, and like you said, yeah, maybe they do exist, but they were probably in the airs and the aisles at the top. You couldn't reach it. You couldn't find it. They didn't get the visibility, and I wish for that, and I
And
hope
like,
for that.
unfortunately, what that tells publishers is that our books don't sell. So like, literally the only way to ensure that we get more books by and about people of color is to buy them,
Yeah,
because
buy
it's,
them support.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
it is about the numbers.
Yeah, because that helps them. That's what they live for. It's the numerical values.
Or request
Uh,
them at libraries, I should say. If you cannot buy them, libraries are also amazing.
yes, folks, if you can go down to your local library, there's a book, an author that you're interested in reading. Let them know you want that. Create that demand. Absolutely. I know that Jennifer goes, "Who was your favorite authors, and what were your favorite books? Do you remember the first book you read that made you decide that you wanted to write?"
Right now, some of my favorite authors are Lee Bardugo and Saba Tahir, and Holly Black. These are all YA authors, by the way.
A lot of young adult.
Um,
Yeah.
And when I was younger, like I said, R.L. Stine was a huge favorite. If I'm trying to remember what book I read that made me want to be a writer, I don't know that I could remember that, but I do know The Hobbit was the first book I read that um, I when I realized that this is what I want to write. Which I realize sounds like a cliche because it's The Hobbit, but I read it in elementary school and it was so good, and I was just obsessed with like the secondary world fantasy that Tolkien had created, and I knew that was the kind of story that I wanted to write. But I had been writing prior to that already. I just knew that, like, once I read Tolkien, like, this is the sort of story I want to write.
That's so good. And I'm glad I have the movies and I watch it like since the pandemic, right? I've been watching them, especially the extended version. Oh my gosh, I've been every movie's like 3 hours long. So I call it the Harry Potter, not Harry, I had those series too, but the whole Hobbit journey experience. I'm
The
like,
Lord of
oh
the
my,
Rings
yeah, the
is
Lord, yeah, it's so
I love
intense.
the trilogy, the
Mhm.
anime, or I was about to say animated, but not the animated, the feature films. I
Yes.
love the feature films. Yes, I wish the feature films for The Hobbit had been better because I prefer the Hobbit as a book. But yeah,
That's wonderful. Well, good stuff there. And I know that Ash mentioned, I might have missed it, but please tell us the title of your books again and where we can make a purchase. Thank you so much, Ash, for asking that. I know we're wrapping up soon. If you go actually to Lori's website right there, loriemlee.com. And Lori, if you tell us more what's on that website so that way people can be directed to that.
sure. So there should be a link that literally just says books, and then you can click on that and you can see like a list of my books. I can tell you here too. My debut novel was called Gates of Thread and Stone, which is a YA fantasy, and the sequel is The Infinite. And then I have two anthologies where I have a short story. The first is Color Outside the Lines, and the other is called A Thousand Beginnings and Endings. Um, the short story In a Thousand Beginnings and Endings is a sci-fi retelling of The Woman and the Tiger, which is a common Hmong folktale. And then in Color Outside the Lines, it's a short story about a Hmong girl who falls in love with a falling star. Um, and then after that, I have a YA fantasy that just came out last year called Forest of Souls. And then the sequel, Broken Web, which I have right here actually, which this is an advanced reader copy. It's not out till June. And then in September, I have my first middle grade book, which is called PAHUA and the Soul Stealer.
Yes, and I know that we briefly touched upon that. I don't think people understood, like why two books in 1 year, right? Which is very rare for most authors, let alone one book in the span of years, as you were telling us, different pathways. I don't think people realize that they're not from, and correct me if I'm the same publishing company. That's why they're both are publishing magically this year.
Right, they're different publishers. Yes, my publisher for my YA series is called Page Street, and they're really awesome. And then my publisher for PAHUA and the Soul Stealer is Disney Publishing.
And Jennifer goes, before we go, I just want to say how proud we are of you and your success. Thank you for sharing your kernel words of wisdom here. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. Really appreciate that. I know, Lori, there's so much good stuff. Again, we only have an hour, and it goes by so fast. I honestly have a bunch of more questions I wanted to ask you, but we just didn't get to it. And I really appreciate that you're at the forefront here, being a writer, writing about, like putting Hmong characters in your stories. I mean, I think about, I'm like, you could have put anyone. You could put a Santa Claus in your story if you wanted to, right? You could have put the bunny. You could have put it. You could have literally done your own like dark version of Peter Rabbit, right? Whatever it may be, and you chose to put Hmong characters, and I think that's so empowering, and I love it, and I'm so looking forward to it, and I hope our audience able to look for it too. And again, if you can't purchase it, it's okay. Demand it at your local library. And I hope that people out there are inspired to write. It's probably one of the best tools out there. I tell you, if you can write, you can get a lot of things across, whether that is a book, a policy, that skill and ability, like you mentioned, being able to read and write and get critique and get feedback. It's something that doesn't happen overnight. It's a skill you build and you get better and better at it. And I really appreciate you sharing with us your process from, going from the different draft mode to, final edits version, and really pushing out the work you do and sharing with us. It's just really exciting. And I'm wishing you for all the years of success ahead. I can't wait to have you back in the future when your next, who knows, could be the next movie of your books. Who knows, right? So thank you so much. Thank you so much
for having me on.
No problem, Lori. Thank you so much. And folks, if you want to check out Lori's book, head to her website, loriemily.com. You can get more information on how to order and hopefully get the next release dates of her books coming out this year. All right. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, feel free to connect with me. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And thank you so much for everyone for joining me. This is our last episode of this season. We'll come back in a month or two with the second season. But I hope you all enjoy your Wednesday and your weeks ahead. Stay safe, get vaccinated, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye, everyone.